Why learn Chinese? When I was only starting to learn Chinese, I was asked this by many people. Because back then, learning Chinese seemed like an odd thing. It wasn't obvious at all that it would one day become useful. But the situation is entirely different now. China is an economic superpower, and so the choice of learning Chinese seems much more obvious today. So in this video, I would like to share why I think learning Chinese is a good idea and what my own experience was. So if you're interested in this, keep watching. And please hit the subscribe and like buttons to help the channel and to be notified when new videos come online. When I started learning Chinese in the late 1980s, this was not something obvious at all. When I mentioned it to someone, nobody ever said, "Wow, that's great, you really seem to know what you're doing." Instead, most people had this confused look on their face, not understanding where the catch is. And some of them would rather say things like, "Why on earth would you spend your time doing something like that? Why not learn something useful like German or Polish?" And the reason for that is that at the time, China was outside the field of vision of most people, at least the people around me. And I'm sure this was different in other parts of the world, like in San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Vancouver. There must have been a much bigger focus on China, and knowing Chinese would have been a very marketable skill. But Hungary in the 1980s was a completely different world. The country was grinding through the last years of the Soviet regime, and so China and East Asia were really not the focus. Fast forward 35 years, and now China is one of the largest economies in the world. And whatever happens in China doesn't stay in China. Whether good or bad, the implications are felt all around the world. So learning Chinese doesn't seem such a random thing to do. People get it immediately. And so now people say to young people who are learning Chinese, "Of course you're learning Chinese. Why wouldn't you?" I would if I was younger too. Now learning Chinese seems like an entirely reasonable thing to do. It is like a decision that betrays strategic thinking because it's so obvious that knowing Chinese is very, very useful. And it's going to be even more so in the next 10-15 years. I wish I could say that as a 19-year-old, I had the foresight to know how the world economy would develop. And I chose to learn Chinese because I knew where China was heading, that it was going to have a major impact on the world, and Chinese was going to be one of the top foreign languages in most parts of the world. But this was really not the case, and my own reasons for doing Chinese were largely accidental. And I think it's actually true for many of my colleagues. Many of us didn't embark on this journey because we'd figure out what the world was going to be like in the future. So personally, my own story begins with being drafted in the Hungarian military right after high school. I was supposed to serve 18 months, and this was in contrast to most of my friends who only served 12 months because they had been admitted to university. But me, after high school, I was not planning to study any further because I was sick and tired of going to school, and all I wanted to do is to people leave me alone so I could do whatever I wanted to do. And to think back at it, I don't really remember what I wanted to do. It involved a lot of reading, but I'm not sure if I had an idea whether it would take me anywhere. But being drafted, the military, of course, made sure that I had absolutely no time to read. To be sure, this was not an environment conducive to contemplation and reading. And as conscripts in the Hungarian Defense Forces, we had a conflicting mission. We were preparing to withstand assaults from Western European countries, which by that time were seen in a very positive way, and all this to protect a regime everybody was trying to get rid of. So we were supposed to protect a regime we didn't want from a regime we wanted. And the whole thing was an utterly pointless and mind-numbing experience. Very little of it was about military training or any kind of useful training at all. And a lot about psychological abuse and just sheer boredom. So only after a couple of months there, my top priority in life changed from "I don't want to go back to school" to "How the hell do I get out of here? What is the shortest way to leave the army?" And so at that point, going to university and thereby reducing the time I had to serve from 18 to 12 months seemed like a much more appealing option than lying in the snow on a mountain in the stealth of a night, waiting for imaginary tanks of an imaginary enemy. But by that time, I had missed all the available deadlines for that year, and the only deadline I could catch was for a scholarship of the Ministry of Education to study in the People's Republic of China. And so I applied, and for some miraculous reason, I got the scholarship, which meant that I was able to leave the army just after 10 months, which was even better than the 12 months my friends had to serve. And the difference was that I was going to an overseas university, and so for some reason that meant your time was shorter, perhaps because we had to prepare. My major was Chinese language and literature, and the reason for that was that China was given. I was going to China and I had to pick something related to China. And I always liked literature, certainly much better than civil engineering or agriculture. At the same time, ending up studying in China was not entirely random either, because I had always been interested in literature, religions, and different cultures. And in the past, my own family had connections with China. My mother's side is Central Asian, and so my grandmother, who was Kazakh, was born in Harbin, which is now part of Heilongjiang province. But I was not thinking about this at the time. Maybe I hadn't even known about it at that point. But I did have an interest in reading about different cultures. So I did have an interest. It was not specifically limited to China, though. It seems that I needed the military to push me in that concrete direction. And I have to admit that they were very persuasive in motivating people to get out of there. But of course, once you start learning Chinese, your whole perspective on China and all things Chinese changes. And your reasons for pushing on in year 3 or year 6 are entirely different from the ones when you started. This journey becomes part of your life. It becomes part of your identity. So you keep at it because that's what you do. That's who you are. It does have some kind of magnetic force that keeps you from getting away. And this is probably true for any other domain. In any case, looking back at my own experience, regardless of the pragmatic use of the Chinese language, I would still encourage everyone to study it, because it's so different from European languages. And language is such a big part of your cognitive capacities. It has such an impact on how you think about the world. So learning a completely different one really gives you another perspective. But at the same time, knowing Chinese is of course incredibly useful in the modern world. We have always known that China's population was ridiculously large, but it was only after China began opening up, and of course now it's kind of closing down, but at one point it was going in the opposite direction, and so that's when it became clear that knowing Chinese was just very, very useful. As Chinese people started going to other countries, opening up restaurants, stores, and trading companies, but also as students or just tourists. And as it was becoming possible, Western countries were also increasingly interested in doing business in China, in establishing a presence there, to manufacture or sell their products, taking advantage of the size of the market and of the cost of labor. And of course, contacts and exchanges are not limited to business. More and more Chinese students come to overseas universities, and after graduation find jobs and settle there, gradually increasing Chinese presence in almost any country of the world. In addition, we now live in a much more global world, and now there is much more contact between different countries than, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And this globalization naturally includes China, which makes up a big chunk of the world, whether in territory, population, or economy. And so Chinese language and Chinese culture are much more part of our lives today than 30 years ago. Basically, Chinese has become one of the top choices as a foreign language in high school or at the university. It is very attractive to a young student who's only starting to think about the future career. And so the language is increasingly being available as a choice. It is being offered in high schools and middle schools, and in some places even elementary schools. Larger bookstores now have piles of books devoted to learning Chinese, not to speak of the wealth of online content designed to guide you through every step of the journey. And even if you're growing up in a small town in almost any part of the world, be it Greece or the Czech Republic, you will probably have at least a couple of Chinese classmates whose mom will offer you strange snacks when you visit their home. So today we live in an age when Chinese language and culture has become part of the world around us. China is no longer a distant and exotic subject that you study because you want to do something different. It is totally mainstream and an important part of our immediate world. So the question now is not, why would you learn Chinese? But rather, why wouldn't you learn Chinese? Do you have any reason not to learn Chinese? Okay, so these are my own thoughts on the subject and also my own experience. I'm of course very interested in yours, so please put them in the comment section below. I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching and see you next time.